When a wealthy woman demands that Big Shaq leave his own private beach, she has no idea who she's dealing with. What starts as an entitled mistake quickly spirals into a national controversy, exposing deep-rooted privilege, racial bias, and a truth she never saw coming. But the real shock? It's how Shaq chooses to handle it. Because sometimes, the most powerful response isn't revenge. It's something far more unexpected. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high over the Florida coastline, its golden rays dancing on the tranquil waves that kissed the shore. A crisp breeze rolled in from the Atlantic, carrying the scent of salt and summer. The beach stretched endlessly, untouched, pristine, a sanctuary hidden from the chaos of the world. And at the heart of it all was Big Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal, known to millions as a basketball legend and a media giant, had earned his fortune through years of sweat, grit, and unshakable determination. But away from the cameras, away from the endless noise of fame, he was just Shaq, a man who loved the simple joys of life. He had bought this private stretch of coastline not for extravagance, but for peace. A place where he could walk barefoot in the sand, let the waves wash away the weight of expectations, and just be. Dressed in a casual tank top and knee-length shorts, Shaq strolled toward the water, his giant frame casting a shadow long enough to swallow the sand beneath him. In his hand, he clutched a well-worn basketball, spinning it absent-mindedly on his fingertips. Even here, away from the courts, the game was in his blood. A few close friends were already waiting near the beach house, a modern yet understated retreat tucked between palm trees. They laughed, music played softly in the background, and the air smelled of grilled seafood and citrus. This was how Shaq preferred it. Low-key, real, and surrounded by people who saw him as more than just a towering sports icon. The beach itself had become something of a community space, though still private property. Shaq often invited local kids from underprivileged backgrounds to visit, giving them a place to enjoy the ocean without fear of being turned away. He had grown up knowing what it felt like to be treated differently, to be seen as an outsider. That was why he made sure his space was open to those who needed it most. Today, however, he just wanted some solitude. He left his friends behind, walking closer to the shore. The waves lapped at his feet, the warm water swirling around his ankles. He sighed, taking in the stillness, letting the peace settle into his bones. Then, a voice shattered the moment. "Excuse me." Shaq turned, his easy expression shifting into mild curiosity. A woman stood several yards away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked to be in her mid-50s, her skin tanned from too many summers under the sun, her blonde hair tucked beneath an expensive-looking sun hat. Beside her, two younger women, possibly her daughters, stood with their arms folded, watching with interest. "This is a private beach," the woman said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "You can't be here." For a second, Shaq thought she was joking. He glanced around, searching for hidden cameras or a familiar face waiting to laugh and tell him this was some elaborate prank. But the woman's glare was unwavering, her lips pressed into a thin line of irritation. Shaq let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, I know," he said, tossing his basketball into the air and catching it smoothly. "It's mine." The woman blinked, taken aback. Then she scoffed. "That's ridiculous," she said, her tone dripping with disbelief. "I've been coming to this beach for years. There's no way you own it." Shaq studied her for a moment. He had dealt with this kind of thing before, the assumptions, the questioning, the subtle, insidious ways some people refuse to believe that a man like him could own something so beautiful. It wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He could have argued. He could have pulled out his phone and shown her the deed right then and there. Instead, he simply smiled. "That's so," he said casually. "Yes, that's so," the woman snapped. "And I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you need to leave." One of the younger women shifted uncomfortably. "Mom," she murmured, but the older woman silenced her with a quick look. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool. He had nothing to prove to this woman. He had worked too hard, built too much, to let one ignorant stranger get under his skin. "Well," he said slowly, bouncing the ball once against the sand. I think I'll stay. The woman's face turned red. That's not how this works. Shaq chuckled again, but this time there was no humor in it. He turned back toward the water, dismissing her like she was nothing more than an annoying seagull squawking in the background. But the woman wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping furiously against the screen. I'm calling security, she announced. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. This was going to be one of those days. The waves continued to roll in. The sun still hung golden in the sky, and the world outside this moment kept turning. But here, on this strip of sand that he had rightfully claimed as his own, something was shifting. Shaq could feel it. And he had a feeling things were about to get a whole lot more interesting. Shaq stood near the water's edge, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, the ocean breeze washing over him in rhythmic waves. He had come here for peace, to escape the noise of the world. But now, the tranquility of his private retreat was cracking under the weight of entitlement. The woman who had confronted him earlier had not backed down. In fact, she had grown bolder, her voice louder, her posture more rigid. Shaq turned his head slightly, observing her without saying a word. She wasn't alone anymore. Two more women, around their mid-30s, had joined her, both wearing designer swimsuits and expensive sunglasses. Their body language mirrored hers, rigid, entitled, and laced with the kind of quiet arrogance Shaq had seen too many times before. This is ridiculous, the older woman huffed, her manicured nails gripping her phone. He's still here. Shaq arched a brow. He had made it clear that this was his beach. But something about his calmness, his unwavering presence, seemed to fuel her disbelief. He had seen this reaction before. People who couldn't reconcile their expectations with reality. In her mind, a man like him, black, dressed casually standing alone, couldn't possibly be the owner of such a place. One of the younger women stepped closer, lowering her sunglasses slightly to get a better look at Shaq. Her lips parted in recognition, but she hesitated, looking back at the older woman as if unsure whether to say something. Mom, I think… No. The woman cut her off sharply. He doesn't belong here. Shaq's expression didn't change, but inside, a flicker of irritation stirred. He had spent his life rising above ignorance, choosing to let his success speak louder than words. But there was something particularly exhausting about moments like these, when his presence alone was enough to be questioned, when ownership wasn't assumed but challenged. You sure about that? Shaq finally spoke, his deep voice even, measured. The woman lifted her chin. I have been coming to this beach for years. I know everyone who lives in this area. Her eyes flicked up and down his towering frame. And I've never seen you before. Shaq let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Lady, I don't think you know everyone as well as you think you do. The woman's nostrils flared. There's no way you own this place. The second younger woman, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. Mom, maybe we should just… No, Allison, the woman snapped. I know when someone doesn't belong and he… She pointed at Shaq, her voice dripping with condescension. Is not supposed to be here. The moment stretched, tense and uncomfortable. Shaq could feel the weight of her assumption pressing into the space between them. He had experienced this kind of subtle racism his entire life, thinly veiled under the guise of concern or rules. It wasn't always blatant. Sometimes it came in the form of suspicious glances at a luxury store, extra security following him through a hotel lobby, or questions about whether he really owned his expensive car. And now, here it was again. On his beach. Shaq exhaled slowly, forcing the frustration down. He had nothing to prove to this woman. But before he could decide how to respond, movement from the side caught his eye. A group of beachgoers, tourists, most likely, had begun watching the interaction from a distance. Some were whispering, their eyes darting between Shaq and the woman. Then, as if sensing an audience, the woman puffed up, her voice growing louder. I don't care who you think you are, but this is private property. If you don't leave now, I'll call security. Shaq crossed his arms, his towering frame making her seem even smaller in comparison. Go ahead, he said simply. For a moment, the woman hesitated, as if not expecting him to challenge her so directly. But then she straightened, pressing her phone to her ear. Security. Yes, there's a man trespassing on the private beach near the Rockwell estate. He refuses to leave, and he's making me feel unsafe. Shaq's jaw tightened at the word, unsafe. It was a word weaponized too often, used to justify unnecessary confrontations, to place blame where it didn't belong. And he knew exactly how this would play out if the wrong kind of security officer showed up, how quickly the situation could spiral into something ugly. But he wasn't worried. He had dealt with worse. The younger woman, Allison, looked between her mother and Shaq, clearly uncomfortable. "Mom, I really think you're making a mistake," she murmured. The woman ignored her, her sharp gaze fixed on Shaq as if daring him to run, to react, to prove her point. But Shaq didn't move. He stood there, steady as a rock, letting the weight of the moment settle. Minutes passed. The waves continued their rhythmic dance, the sun still beat down, and yet the tension in the air remained thick. Then, in the distance, a security golf cart rolled onto the sand. Shaq remained exactly where he was. He had nothing to hide, nothing to explain. But he also knew this wasn't just about ownership anymore. It was about perception. The security guard, a middle-aged man in a polo shirt and sunglasses, stepped out of the cart, glancing between Shaq and the woman. "What's going on here?" he asked. The woman turned to him, her expression shifting into one of practiced concern. "This man is trespassing," she said. "I asked him to leave, but he refused. He's making me feel uncomfortable." The guard frowned, his eyes moving to Shaq. Recognition flashed across his face, but he kept his tone neutral. "Sir, do you have permission to be here?" Shaq chuckled softly. "I don't need permission." The guard hesitated. "Sir." Shaq reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A few taps later, he turned the screen around, showing an official document with his name clearly listed as the property owner. The guard leaned in, reading it carefully. His posture shifted immediately. "Oh," he muttered, clearing his throat. He straightened and looked at the woman. "Ma'am, this is Mr. O'Neal's property." The woman's face went pale. "Excuse me?" she asked, blinking rapidly. "That can't be right." The guard nodded. "It is. He owns this entire stretch of beach." Shaq could see the reality sinking in, the way her carefully crafted world of assumptions cracked under the weight of undeniable truth. There was a long, painful silence. The woman's lips parted as if searching for something, anything, to say that would give her the upper hand again. But she found nothing. Shaq watched, waiting for the next move. Would she apologize? Would she admit she was wrong? The woman's mouth opened, then closed. Instead of acknowledging her mistake, she turned sharply on her heel. "Allison, let's go," she snapped, storming off toward the parking lot without another word. Allison hesitated, looking at Shaq with something that almost resembled regret. Then she sighed and followed her mother. Shaq exhaled, watching them leave. He had dealt with plenty of people like her in his lifetime, and he knew that despite the embarrassment she had just suffered, she would likely tell herself a different story later, one where she was the victim, where she had been intimidated or misunderstood. But he didn't care. The ocean remained unchanged, the sky just as bright, the waves just as endless. And this beach, it was still his. As the security guard gave him an apologetic nod and drove off, Shaq turned back toward the water, letting the moment pass like the tide. But something told him this wasn't over yet. Shaq stood with his feet buried in the warm sand, the ocean breeze ruffling his shirt as he watched the woman's retreating figure. He had expected her to leave, humiliated but unwilling to acknowledge her mistake. But instead, she stopped just short of the parking lot, her shoulders stiff, her hand still gripping her phone like a weapon. She turned back around, her face flushed with something more than embarrassment, anger. She wasn't done. "I don't care what some paper says," she called out, her voice sharp, slicing through the peaceful air. "People like you don't own places like this." Shaq let out a slow breath through his nose, steadying himself. He had heard a lot in his life. Ignorance, racism, entitlement, wrapped in a thin veil of authority. But no matter how much he prepared himself for moments like these, it always struck a chord deep inside him. Before he could respond, the younger woman, Allison, touched her mother's arm, her voice low but urgent. "Mom, please, just let it go." But the woman jerked her arm away. "No, Allison, this is wrong. I know I'm right." Shaq turned fully toward her now, his towering frame making the distance between them seem even greater. His voice remained calm, but his patience was thinning. "Lady, I told you already, this is my beach. I own the land. I pay the taxes. I built the damn house that sits back there." He gestured toward the sleek modern beach house tucked between the palm trees. She glanced at it, but instead of backing down, her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You expect me to believe that? That someone like you owns a multi-million-dollar property on one of the most exclusive parts of the coast?" A couple of people sitting under umbrellas nearby had started paying attention, their conversations quieting. Some of them looked at Shaq, their eyes widening in recognition, while others looked between him and the woman, uncertain. Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. "I don't expect you to believe anything, but the fact is I do." She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing. "Then prove it." He stared at her for a beat. He had already proved it. He had shown her the property records on his phone. The security guard had confirmed it. And yet, she was still demanding more. It wasn't about proof anymore. It was about power. "I don't owe you anything," Shaq said simply. The woman's face darkened. "That's what I thought," she muttered, her voice thick with accusation. A man in his 40s, wearing sunglasses and holding a half-empty drink, stood up from his lounge chair a few feet away. "Hey, lady," he said, shaking his head. "I don't know what your problem is, but that is Shaquille O'Neal. The Shaquille O'Neal. This is his property." The woman blinked at him, startled. "What?" The man let out a short laugh. "You really don't recognize him? NBA legend? Hall of Famer? Business mogul? That Shaq?" Her mouth opened slightly, as if trying to find a way to dismiss it. But then, another voice chimed in. "He's right," said a woman sitting under a nearby beach umbrella. "Shaq owns this place. He's been living here for years. Everyone in the area knows that." The woman's gaze flicked between them, her confidence wavering. She turned back to Shaq, her face twisting as if trying to process what she had just heard. But instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "I don't care who he is," she snapped. "I still don't believe it." Shaq sighed, shaking his head. Some people were incapable of admitting when they were wrong. The small crowd had grown now. Beachgoers who had once been focused on their books, their drinks, their sunbathing, were all watching. Some whispered to each other, pointing at Shaq, while others scowled at the woman. A few, however, remained on the fence, as if waiting to see how things would play out before picking a side. Allison, who had been silent for most of the exchange, suddenly turned to her mother, her voice sharp with frustration. "Mom, enough! You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm not embarrassing myself," her mother hissed. "I'm standing up for what's right." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "And what exactly is right here?" The woman opened her mouth, but for the first time, no words came out. A man near the back of the crowd, an older gentleman with gray hair, adjusted his glasses and spoke up. "Ma'am, I don't know what your issue is, but you might want to stop digging before you bury yourself completely." A few people chuckled, but the woman remained rigid, her jaw tight. Then, from somewhere within the crowd, another voice emerged, one that changed the energy completely. She wouldn't be doing this if he wasn't black. Silence. The weight of the words settled over the scene like a heavy fog. Even the ocean seemed to hush, the waves suddenly quieter against the shore. Shaq's expression remained unreadable, but inside, something twisted. He hadn't said it himself, but the truth of it hung in the air. The woman's face went red. "That is not what this is about," she snapped, her voice suddenly defensive. "Isn't it?" the voice challenged. The tension thickened. Some people in the crowd exchanged knowing looks, while others seemed uncomfortable, shifting where they stood. Shaq had seen this play out before. Someone so wrapped up in their own prejudice that they didn't even recognize it. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't want to admit it. He exhaled slowly, glancing at the woman one last time. Lady, you can tell yourself whatever you need to, but this is my beach, and I'm not going anywhere. A long, heavy pause. Then, without another word, the woman turned sharply and stormed toward the parking lot, her sandals kicking up sand with every furious step. Allison hesitated, glancing at Shaq one last time before following after her mother. The moment stretched as everyone watched them leave. Then, slowly, the crowd started dispersing, murmurs filling the air. Some people gave Shaq nods of respect. A few even clapped lightly before returning to their chairs, conversations, and drinks. Shaq let out a long breath, running a hand over his face. He hadn't come here for this. He had wanted a quiet day, a few hours of peace before life pulled him back into its relentless pace. But peace was never guaranteed. He turned back toward the water, letting the sun warm his skin again. The waves were still rolling, still crashing onto the shore like they had for thousands of years. They didn't care about human ignorance, about entitlement, about the weight of history, and neither did he. But something told him. This wasn't over yet. The sun burned high overhead, its rays bouncing off the sand as the ocean waves crashed rhythmically behind Shaq. He had dealt with people like this woman before, but something about her stubbornness, her refusal to back down even when faced with undeniable proof, made this encounter different. This wasn't just ignorance, it was entitlement turned into a weapon. And now she had escalated it. Still gripping her phone, she stood a few feet away, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. Her voice, sharp and controlled, carried across the beach. "Yes, hello. I need security down here immediately," she said, her tone dripping with manufactured distress. "There's a man trespassing on private property. He's refusing to leave and I feel threatened." Shaq exhaled slowly, keeping his expression neutral. He knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just calling for assistance. She was crafting a narrative, twisting reality to fit her version of events. She wasn't concerned about her safety. She was using the word threatened deliberately, knowing the weight it carried. A few people in the crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Some had their phones out, recording. Others whispered among themselves. But no one stepped forward. No one outright challenged her. The woman ended the call and turned back toward Shaq, her expression smug. "We'll see what security has to say about this," she muttered, folding her arms across her chest. Shaq didn't move. He had nothing to run from, nothing to hide. He had spent years building his name, his legacy, his empire. But none of that mattered in moments like these. Not when someone had already decided who they thought he was. Minutes passed, stretching uncomfortably in the thick summer heat. Then, in the distance, the low hum of an engine broke the silence. A security golf cart rolled onto the sand, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Two uniformed men sat in the front, one driving, the other scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. As they approached, Shaq caught the flicker of recognition in the driver's face. The cart came to a stop, and both officers stepped out. One was younger, lean with short-cropped blonde hair. The other, older, had a graying mustache and the kind of hardened expression that came from dealing with years of entitled beachgoers. The older officer adjusted his belt and looked at the woman. "You the one who called?" "Yes," she said, gesturing toward Shaq. "This man is trespassing. I told him to leave, but he's refusing. He's making me feel unsafe." The younger officer's eyes darted to Shaq. For a split second, his mouth twitched, as if realizing the absurdity of what was happening. But then, instead of addressing the woman's obvious mistake, he hesitated. The older officer's gaze lingered on Shaq for a beat too long. "Sir, can we have a word?" Shaq crossed his arms, already knowing where this was going. "You can ask me anything." The officer's jaw tightened slightly at Shaq's calm response. "Can we see some ID?" A murmur ran through the small crowd. Someone whispered, "Seriously?" while another let out a low scoff. Shaq tilted his head, looking at the officer with something between amusement and frustration. "You want my ID? On my property?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. He knew. He recognized Shaq. But instead of speaking up, he let the moment hang. The woman's arms remained tightly folded across her chest, her expression triumphant. She had expected this, wanted this. Shaq let out a slow breath. He wasn't about to let this turn into something worse. With a controlled, deliberate motion, he reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet and flipped it open. The older officer took it, glancing down. And there it was. The name Shaquille O'Neal printed clearly in bold letters. A beat of silence. Then the younger officer exhaled sharply, finally speaking up. "Oh, come on," he muttered under his breath. The older officer's expression changed, his face paling slightly. He looked at Shaq, then at the woman, then back at the ID in his hand. Shaq didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The older officer cleared his throat, handing the ID back. His voice was noticeably more measured now. "Sir, do you own this property?" Shaq gave him a flat look. "Yeah, that's what I've been saying." The younger officer turned to the woman, his patience visibly thinning. "Ma'am, this is Mr. O'Neal's beach. He's not trespassing." The color drained from the woman's face. That can't be right," she stammered. "Are you sure?" The younger officer's jaw tensed. "Yes, ma'am." For the first time since this whole ordeal started, the woman faltered. She glanced at Shaq, her lips pressing together so tightly they nearly disappeared. But instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging that she had been wrong, she shook her head, as if trying to rewrite reality in her mind. I didn't know," she muttered, her voice lower now. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That was always the excuse, wasn't it? "I didn't know. I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to be racist." The problem wasn't that she didn't know, it was that she had assumed. The younger officer turned back to Shaq, clearly uncomfortable with how this had played out. "Sorry for the trouble, sir," he said. Shaq studied him for a moment. He wasn't angry at him, not entirely. The kid had recognized the truth early on, but had hesitated. Hesitated, because in situations like this, the weight of perception could be dangerous. Shaq gave him a short nod. "You good, man? But next time?" He glanced at the older officer. "Maybe ask more questions before assuming who the problem is." The younger officer nodded, his jaw tightening slightly, as if he understood exactly what Shaq was saying. The older officer, on the other hand, shifted his weight uncomfortably. "We'll just head out then." The woman looked like she wanted to protest, but she must have realized there was no ground left to stand on. Without another word, she turned sharply and stormed toward the parking lot. Allison followed behind, but before leaving, she turned back to Shaq. Her gaze flickered with something that almost looked like shame. I didn't think it would go this far," she admitted. Shaq studied her, then shrugged. "Yeah, well, it did." She hesitated a moment longer, then lowered her gaze and walked away. The crowd that had gathered slowly began dispersing. Some people shook their heads in frustration, while others murmured to each other. A few gave Shaq nods of respect before returning to their beach chairs. Shaq turned toward the ocean, inhaling deeply. The waves were still rolling, the sun still shining, the earth still spinning. But something about this moment lingered. This wasn't the first time he had been questioned, challenged, assumed to be in the wrong, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But no matter how many times it happened, one thing remained the same. He wasn't going anywhere. The ocean stretched endlessly before Shaq, its vastness a reminder of how small moments like these were in the grand scheme of life. But no matter how many times he told himself that, the weight of what had just happened sat heavy in his chest. He had seen it unfold in slow motion. The entitlement, the accusation, the subtle but deliberate way the woman had painted him as a threat. It was a story he had lived before, too many times to count. His mind drifted back to his younger days, to a time before the world knew his name. He remembered being 17, walking into a high-end clothing store with his friends, money in his pocket, ready to buy something nice for himself. The way the sales associate had watched him, her gaze sharp, her body language tense. How she had subtly but purposefully stayed within a few feet of him at all times, as if expecting him to shove something into his pockets and run. He had left without buying a thing. He thought about his rookie year in the NBA, when he had just signed his first big contract. He had walked into a luxury car dealership, excited to buy the car he had always dreamed of. The salesman had barely looked at him before saying, "Are you sure you can afford this?" Shaq had smiled then, the way he always did. He had pulled out his checkbook and paid for the car in full. But even then, the sting had been there, just beneath the surface. And now, all these years later, a woman on his beach had done the same thing. Assumed he didn't belong. Assumed he was a threat. Assumed he was less. The worst part? He had expected it. Shaq let out a slow breath, pulling himself back to the present. The woman was gone, but the moment still lingered in the air, clinging to the onlookers like humidity. Some had already turned back to their books, their drinks, their conversations. But others still watched him, their expressions unreadable. His patience had been tested, and for a second he had felt the urge to push back harder, to call her out, to demand an apology. But what would that have done? People like her didn't apologize, not in ways that mattered. Still, he couldn't just let it end like this, not without turning it into something bigger than a moment of ignorance. A slow smile crept across his face as an idea took shape. He turned toward a group of kids playing near the edge of the water, local kids from the nearby community center. He had invited them here, just as he often did, to give them a place to enjoy the ocean without being told they weren't welcome. One of them, a boy no older than 10, stood watching him with wide eyes. Shaq recognized that look. It was the same one he had worn as a kid whenever he saw injustice unfold, confused, frustrated, trying to understand a world that didn't always make sense. Shaq motioned him over. The boy hesitated for only a moment before jogging toward him. "You ever met a racist lady before?" Shaq asked, his voice light but knowing. The boy's brows furrowed. "I think so," he admitted. Shaq nodded. "You ever had somebody treat you like you didn't belong?" The boy kicked at the sand. "Yeah, one time me and my cousin were riding bikes near this fancy neighborhood. This man came outside and told us we couldn't be there." Shaq squatted down so they were at eye level. "And how'd that make you feel?" The boy shrugged, but there was something guarded in his eyes. "Mad, I guess." Shaq reached out and gave the boy's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Yeah, I get that." He stood up, looking out at the water, then back at the other kids still playing. "You know what helps when people act like that?" he asked. The boy shook his head. Shaq grinned. "Having so much fun that they realize they can't ruin your day." He turned back toward the crowd. "Hey," he called out. "Who wants to have a beach party?" The kids immediately cheered, their excitement infectious. Some of the adults laughed, clapping as the energy shifted. Even a few of the onlookers who had been tense just moments ago smiled, as if relieved that the mood had changed. Shaq jogged toward a nearby speaker system, cranking up the music. The smooth beat of an old-school classic rolled across the sand. Within moments, the beach transformed. Laughter, music, movement. It was as if the confrontation had never happened. But it had happened. And that was the point. Shaq wasn't going to let a bitter woman's ignorance taint the space he had built. Instead, he was going to make sure everyone knew what this beach was really about: joy, inclusion, and belonging. As the party kicked off, Shaq leaned back against a beach chair, watching as people danced, played, and soaked in the moment. He caught a glimpse of Allison standing near the parking lot, watching with an unreadable expression. For a second, he wondered if she understood what had just happened. How her mother had tried to claim power over a place that was never hers to begin with. How Shaq had refused to let her win. He gave Allison a small nod, then turned away. He had handled this exactly the way he wanted to. And as the sun sank lower in the sky, casting golden light over his beach, he knew one thing for sure. This place would always belong to him. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the beach. The confrontation should have ended by now, but it hadn't. Even after security had confirmed Shaq's ownership, even after her accusation had crumbled in front of a crowd, the woman still stood there, her jaw clenched, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her daughters lingered behind her, clearly uncomfortable. Allison kept darting uncertain glances at Shaq, while the younger one, who had barely spoken through the ordeal, stared at the ground. They both looked like they wanted to disappear. But their mother wasn't ready to let it go. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, shaking her head. "There has to be a mistake." Shaq, standing tall with his hands on his hips, let out a slow breath. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice calm but firm. She looked up at him sharply, her eyes flashing with something close to desperation. "I just find it very hard to believe that you—" She hesitated, as if realizing how that sounded. "That someone like you owns all of this." There it was again. The crowd hadn't fully dispersed. A few people still watched from a distance, pretending to be uninterested while sipping their drinks or adjusting their umbrellas. But Shaq could feel their curiosity, their quiet judgments lingering in the air. He didn't need to prove anything to this woman. He had already won. But there was something about her stubbornness, her refusal to see the truth, that made him want to make it absolutely, undeniably clear. With a slight smirk, he pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through his contacts. It rang twice before a deep, professional voice answered on the other end. "Mr. O'Neal," the man greeted. "Everything all right?" Shaq kept his gaze locked on the woman. "Hey, David, do me a favor and tell this lady who owns the property at the Rockwell Beach address." There was a brief pause before David, his lawyer, responded smoothly. "That would be you, sir. The deed is registered in your name, and the estate has been in your possession for over 5 years." Shaq tilted his head. "You hear that?" The woman's lips parted, but no words came out. Shaq wasn't done. "And just to be crystal clear, I own all of it, right? The beach, the house, the private road leading in?" David chuckled. "Yes, Shaq, it's all yours. Is there a problem?" Shaq glanced at the woman, giving her one last chance to say something, anything reasonable. But she just stood there, her face tight with denial. "Nah," Shaq said, hanging up. "No problem at all." For the first time since this started, her arrogance wavered. Her shoulders tensed, and her grip on her phone loosened slightly. She looked at the ground, then at her daughters, as if hoping for some kind of backup. Allison sighed. "Mom, you were wrong," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The woman flinched, as if the words physically stung her. She started, her voice thin. "I didn't think—" "You didn't think, period," Shaq interrupted. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried weight. "You assumed. And when you assume, you show the world exactly who you are." The younger daughter, who had stayed quiet through everything, finally spoke. "We should go." For a second, it looked like their mother might still argue. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, her jaw working. But then, finally, she exhaled and turned away. Without another word, she started toward the parking lot, her daughters trailing behind her. Shaq watched them go. He didn't feel satisfied. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt tired. But as he turned back toward the water, he noticed something else. The people who had been watching, some white, some black, some Latino, some a mix of everything, were looking at him differently. Not with pity, not with condescension, but with respect. One man, a father with his young son in tow, gave Shaq a small nod. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said. "That was hard to watch." Shaq exhaled. "Yeah, well, welcome to my life." The father hesitated, then extended a hand. "For what it's worth, I appreciate how you handled it." Shaq shook his hand, then watched as the man walked off with his son, the boy still looking at him like he was larger than life. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't just about him. This was about everybody who had ever been told they didn't belong in a space they had every right to be in. It was about the kids who saw what had happened and understood, maybe for the first time, that no matter how successful they became, they'd always have to prove themselves in ways others never would. But it was also about the people who had watched and learned, the ones who had hesitated before, but maybe next time, they wouldn't. Shaq turned back to the ocean, the waves still rolling in like they always had, like they always would. And just like that, it was over. The sun had barely set when Shaq's phone started buzzing. At first he ignored it, assuming it was just another routine call. But then another came, and another. He finally glanced at the screen, missed calls, texts, notifications piling up. Something was happening. Just as he was about to check, one of his friends, Trey, jogged up from the beach house, his phone in hand, eyes wide. "Bro," "You've seen this?" Shaq frowned. "Seen what?" Trey turned his phone around. A video played on the screen. It was him, standing on the beach, arms crossed, calm, but firm. The woman, red-faced, waving her hands, voice sharp. The grainy recording captured it all. The accusations, the entitled disbelief, the security guards hesitating despite knowing exactly who he was. The caption: Karen tries to kick Shaquille O'Neal off his own private beach. Wait till you see what happens next. Shaq exhaled through his nose. He already knew how this was going to play out. "Where's this from?" he asked, though he already had a feeling. Trey scrolled. "Man, it's everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Someone posted it an hour ago and it's already at over 1 million views." Shaq took the phone and scrolled through the comments. Some were exactly what he expected. "This is why we say privilege is real. She didn't even consider he could own it. Shaq handled this better than most would. I would have lost my damn mind. Why do people always assume black men don't belong in nice places?" But then there were the other kinds of comments. Maybe she really didn't know. Why does everything have to be about race? She felt threatened. Y'all always trying to play the victim. Guarantee you if he wasn't famous, the outcome would have been different. Shaq let out a slow breath. He wasn't new to this. The internet thrived on conflict. People picked sides, argued over things that should have been obvious, and twisted reality into whatever fit their beliefs. And then, just as expected, the deeper digging began. Someone had already found the woman's name. Within minutes, Twitter had her LinkedIn, her Facebook, even old interviews she'd done for some charity work. And it didn't take long before the real picture came together. Her husband was a high-powered real estate developer, one with a history of buying up beachfront properties and flipping them for outrageous profits. She wasn't just some random rich woman with an attitude. She came from a family that had built their wealth by taking spaces, by deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, people were furious. Screenshots of her past comments surfaced. A blog post from 5 years ago, where she had ranted about how certain types of people were ruining the exclusivity of beachfront communities. A Facebook comment where she complained about outsiders lowering property values. Shaq stared at the screen. It was worse than he thought. Trey let out a low whistle. "She's done, man. She's about to get dragged." Shaq rubbed a hand over his face. He had no love for the woman, but he also knew what social media did to people when they became the villain of the week. They'd pick apart her life, her family, her past, until there was nothing left. And while part of him thought, well, she brought it on herself, another part of him wasn't sure how he felt about it. He had wanted her to see the truth, to understand what she had done. But would she? Or would she just see herself as the victim now? A new notification popped up on his phone. A journalist from a major network wanted a statement. Shaq sighed. It was going to be a long night. The internet had done what it always did, turning a single moment into a cultural firestorm. Less than 24 hours after the video of the beach altercation went viral, it was everywhere. Major news outlets had picked it up, social media debates were raging, and millions of people had seen the entitled woman trying to kick Shaq off his own private beach. People weren't just angry, they were furious. Her name was no longer just a footnote in a controversy. It was the headline. Journalists dug into her background, uncovering layers of privilege and entitlement that painted an even uglier picture. Her family, known for their wealth and real estate dealings, had long been accused of pushing out lower-income communities to make room for luxury developments. The backlash was relentless. Her husband's business partners were pulling away, her social circles were distancing themselves, and rumors swirled that her children were being harassed online. And yet, Shaq had said nothing. He hadn't posted about it, hadn't given an interview, hadn't so much as acknowledged the viral storm brewing around the incident. Instead, he had let the world argue over what should happen next. Then, just as expected, the woman's legal team reached out. They wanted a discussion, a way to resolve the situation, a chance for her to apologize publicly. Shaq wasn't surprised. She wasn't doing this because she had suddenly found self-awareness. She was doing it because her reputation, and possibly her husband's business, was on the verge of collapse. Still, he agreed to meet. Not for her, but because he knew moments like these had the power to change the conversation in ways that went beyond just one viral clip. 2 days later, in a sleek Miami law office, they sat across from each other at a long, polished conference table. Cameras were set up. Reporters had been given access. The world was watching. She arrived looking completely different from the woman who had stood on that beach. Gone was the sharp, entitled posture. Her shoulders were drawn inward, her face pale. She was dressed in neutral tones, no designer sunglasses, no expensive jewelry. She had come here to play the role of someone humbled, but Shaq had seen too many apologies like this before. He leaned back in his chair, his massive hands folded together as she cleared her throat and began to speak. "I want to apologize," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I made assumptions that were incorrect, and in doing so, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it." Shaq said nothing. The silence was thick, stretching across the room, making her shift uncomfortably. She swallowed. "I understand now that my words and actions were rooted in biases I wasn't even fully aware of, and I regret how I handled that situation." Still, Shaq didn't respond. The reporters leaned in slightly, sensing the tension. Finally, Shaq exhaled and tilted his head. "What exactly do you regret?" The woman blinked, as if thrown off by the directness of the question. I regret accusing you of trespassing." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "That's it?" Her fingers clenched slightly on the table. For a second, she hesitated, then spoke more carefully. "I regret making assumptions about who should own a place like that," she admitted. "And I regret escalating the situation instead of listening. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than he expected." The room remained silent, all eyes on Shaq. This was the moment where he could break her, where he could demand more, push harder, make her feel the weight of what she had done. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Okay." The woman's lips parted slightly, confused. "Okay?" Shaq nodded. "Okay." Her breath hitched, and for the first time real uncertainty flickered in her eyes. She had expected outrage, a lecture, a call for punishment. Instead, Shaq just looked at her, calm and steady. "You messed up," he said. "Now is what you do next." The words hung in the air, pressing against her. Shaq knew that apologies were easy. Saying sorry was easy. But real change, that was something only she could decide. He studied her, then added, "I'm not interested in ruining your life. That's not how I move. But you need to ask yourself, are you actually sorry? Or are you just sorry the world saw it?" The cameras caught everything. The slight tremble in her hands, the way her daughters shifted in their seats, the realization that this moment wasn't just about saving face anymore. She had no response. Shaq sat back, his job here done. He didn't need to hear anything else. He had given her the opportunity to truly reflect, to step beyond damage control and into actual accountability. Whether she took it or not, that was on her. He pushed back his chair, towering over the table as he stood. He nodded to the reporters, signaling that he was finished. "We're done here." And just like that, it was over. Not because he let her off the hook, but because he knew true accountability wasn't about forcing an apology. It was about whether or not she changed after it. And that, only time would tell. The waves crashed against the shore, steady as ever, unbothered by the storm that had passed. It had been a week since the incident on the beach, but the echoes of that moment still lingered in the air. Shaq sat on his beachfront patio, the sun dipping toward the horizon, casting everything in a warm golden glow. It was quiet now, just the rhythmic sound of the tide and the distant laughter of children playing near the water. His phone, however, hadn't stopped buzzing for days. The conversation that had started with one woman's arrogance had exploded into something much bigger. News channels dissected every angle of the event. Panel discussions debated the deeper implications, and social media still hadn't let it go. Some people had taken the woman's public apology at face value, believing that she had truly learned something from the experience. Others weren't so sure. The internet had its way of moving on, but not before pulling every last thread from a story like this. And yet, through all of it, Shaq had chosen to remain mostly silent. He didn't need to engage in every discussion or validate every opinion. He had said what he needed to say, handled the situation the way he saw fit, and that was enough. But one thing had changed. His beach, his private, peaceful retreat, was no longer just his. That weekend, something unexpected happened. People from the local community, young and old, black, white, and everything in between, started showing up. Families who had never dared to step foot on these sands before now walked freely, setting up umbrellas and blankets, letting their kids run into the waves without hesitation. Shaq watched from his patio as a father tossed a football to his son. A group of teenagers played beach volleyball, and a couple strolled along the shoreline, hands intertwined. This place, once nearly empty on most days, was now alive in a way it had never been before. Not because of him, but because people now knew they had a right to be here. It wasn't just a local shift. The impact had stretched far beyond this stretch of sand. A well-known civil rights organization had reached out, wanting to talk about creating more spaces of inclusivity in private beach communities. A group of young activists had started a campaign, highlighting similar stories of racial profiling in places of wealth and privilege. Even the local government had taken notice. A city council member had publicly addressed the issue, calling for discussions about better enforcement of anti-discrimination policies in private communities. And then, there was the unexpected outcome. A well-known real estate firm, one that had ties to the woman's family, announced a donation to a program aimed at helping underprivileged youth gain access to recreational spaces. It wasn't an admission of guilt, not outright, but the timing was too convenient to ignore. Shaq smirked when he saw the headlines. He knew how the game worked. They weren't changing out of the kindness of their hearts. They were protecting their interests, their image. But still, change was change. And if that meant kids who had never seen the ocean before now had a chance to, then it was worth it. As for her, she had retreated from public view. The internet had found new things to be angry about, new controversies to fuel the outrage cycle. While her name still floated around in think pieces and discussion panels, her moment in the spotlight was fading. Shaq didn't waste energy thinking about whether she had truly changed. That wasn't his burden to carry. She had been forced to confront something uncomfortable about herself. What she did with that truth was up to her. Later that evening, as the sky shifted from gold to deep purple, a familiar group of kids wandered up to his patio. "Big Shaq," one of them called out, grinning. "You got time for a game?" Shaq laughed, standing up. "You really think you can beat me?" The kids erupted in laughter as he grabbed a basketball from the side of the house, spinning it on his finger. They ran ahead, heading toward the makeshift court he had set up near the beach. But before he followed, one boy, maybe 11 or 12, lingered back. He looked up at Shaq, hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Shaq nodded. "Go ahead." The boy shifted his weight. "When that lady was yelling at you, how come you didn't yell back?" Shaq studied him for a moment, then crouched down so they were eye level. "Because I've been in that situation before," he said simply. "And I knew that no matter what I said, she wasn't going to listen." The boy frowned. "But she was wrong." "She was," Shaq agreed. "But here's the thing. You don't always have to fight to win." The boy still looked uncertain, so Shaq continued. "Sometimes the best way to handle people like that is to let them show the world who they really are. And then, you move on. You don't let them take your peace." The boy thought about that, then nodded slowly. "That's kinda smart." Shaq chuckled. "Kinda?" The boy grinned. "Okay, really smart." Shaq patted his shoulder. "Come on, let's play." As they ran toward the court, Shaq felt a rare sense of stillness. The incident had come and gone. The headlines would fade, the debates would quiet, and eventually, something new would take its place. But this moment, the way this beach felt now, was different. And that would last. What happened on Shaq's beach isn't just a story. It's a reality many face every day. If you believe in creating spaces where everyone belongs, keep the conversation going. Share this story, challenge bias when you see it, and stand up for what's right. Because change doesn't just happen, it starts with you.